The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home by Joseph Fink and Jeffrey Craner, Chapter 2. My father did not wish me to know what he did for a living. And if he had his way, I would still likely not know. But few of us ever get our way in this world. We accommodate what life gives us and do our best to retain some sense of ourselves. Father had a business partner, a man named Edmund. Edmund and my father grew up together, my father nearly 10 years older. My father had looked after the younger Edmund, teaching him to fish and row a boat, teaching the young boy to be in nature, to find work that used the whole of his body, to take in the world through all 5 senses. But Edmund took a liking to math. He was a thinking man, enjoying calculations and finance. Life was Edmund's puzzle to solve. He was much smarter than most children, and despite their differences, my father had hired a 12-year-old Edmund to help with the bookkeeping and inventory of my father's warehouse. And that began a partnership that would last throughout my father's life. Edmund would frequently join us for dinner, where he would pull faces that made me laugh and ask me questions about what new parts of the estate I had discovered that day. I enjoyed his visits immensely, and it always made me angry when my father would tell me I needed to go to bed so that he and Edmund could have conversations for adults. At 6, of course, I thought I was as adult as anyone could be, and it seemed unfair that I would be left out of these discussions as though I were a child. I would stand at my bedroom door listening through the crack and trying to make out even a single word, but my father was aware of such tricks and always moved the conversation to the far side of the kitchen, where even the sharp hearing of the young would be unable to eavesdrop over the cackle of the fire. All I could hear was the occasional roar of laughter from Edmund, always an enthusiastic man. Despite the annoyance of secrecy, I enjoyed Edmund's visits, and in many ways he became a second father to me. He traveled much for work and was always bringing me little gifts and souvenirs: a painted seashell from France, a tiny bag of cinnamon from Morocco, a figurine of a horse from Schwyz. He always seemed to be going to a new country, and he always had some trinket of that country for me. They decorated a shelf in my room, and since I never left the estate, they formed a tactile map of the world. This is what Spain sounds like. This is what Francia feels like. Once in my youngest years, I did stumble upon my father in the midst of his work. I woke up one evening from a dream in which my mother was alive, only she wasn't my mother, but someone very much like my mother. She had no face and was hiding somewhere in my house, and I couldn't find her. Even as I saw her moving in the corner of my eye, I was crying as I woke, the terror of the unknowable entity. An unseeable face still causing me to pant. I ran to my father's room, but he wasn't there. I called for him, and there was no answer. Then I looked out the window and saw lamps down at the water. Frightened, but determined to find my father, I pulled on a shawl and ran barefoot down through the grass to the water. There I saw my father and Edmund and a third man with a rough, scarred cheek and disheveled clothes. They were pulling a rowboat full of canvas bundles onto the shore. The sharp oil smell of the lamps hit me from several meters away. The man with the scarred cheek saw me and shouted in alarm, but my father waved him quiet. "There's been a shipwreck, little one," he said. Fortunately, we were able to help with the rescue. Go back to bed. I'll tell you about it in the morning." In the morning, he refused to provide any details. Later, I remembered that Edmund had not visited us in months. What had he been doing at the estate so late at night when the shipwreck happened? There is one person left to mention from my childhood, and I don't remember when it was that I met Albert, only that from my earliest years he was there. He was 4 days older than me, and so we grew in unison. When I explored the grounds, often Albert was with me. We would play hide and seek in the orange groves. We would swim together in the cove, daring each other to hold our breath longer, to dive farther, to grab stones at the bottom of the deepest point of the cove. He was a better swimmer than me by far. Despite my years with the water, my mother's death caused me to associate the sea with danger, so I was not as fearless as Albert when it came to these challenges. Once he jumped from a cliff at least 10 meters high, missing the rocks by only a few body lengths. It wasn't the water that frightened me, it was the fall. I tried to imagine falling that far, then hitting the water and continuing to fall deep below until I settled on the soft sand of the bottom. When Albert dared me to follow him, I demurred, pretending that I had to get home for dinner. I could see in his eyes that he saw through my excuse, but even as young as we were, he did not take the opportunity to mock me, instead pretending to believe me. Other children from other estates came and went, but Albert was always there. My father, noticing our friendship, would sometimes invite him for dinner, but Albert always had to return to his house. I would ask him about which estate he belonged in, and he would point vaguely in a different direction each time. It became clear he did not want me to visit his home. I sensed he was ashamed of his family, perhaps because they were one of the brutal landlord families always terrorizing the peasants in the nearby valleys, or because he belonged to a strictly religious family that did not like to fraternize with outsiders. Like my timidity with the water, Albert's evasiveness about his home became a thing we did not speak about because there were always so much delight to do and see instead. Chapter 3. Although our estate was difficult to spy from the sea, there were places on the cliffs easily accessible from our home, from which you could watch the passing ship traffic, and this I did often, enjoying identifying which of the ships belonged to governments, which were merchant ships, which were the pleasure yachts of royalty and the rich, and which were the schooners of pirates and bandits that flew no colors, moving stolen cargo and attacking pleasure yachts that had not shelled out sufficiently for mercenaries and bodyguards. Soon, through the boredom and patience of a child, I had a better grasp on the routes of the various factions than most of the well-informed spies of kings and emperors. By age 7, I knew most of the ships in the region by name. If they passed close enough to our cliffs, I might even know the crew members by prominent physical traits. Here is Bee Sting from Portugal, and the navigator has bushy red hair and a limp. Here is the Lady Belle, a ship of bandits from right up the coast, their leader missing his left hand. And so it was a great surprise to me when I saw a ship I did not recognize. The idea of seeing a vessel for which I had no information was astonishing to me. With the serene certainty of a child, I knew all there was to be known about the world. This new ship was smaller, like the ships of the bandits, but it flew a flag. The flag was black and had an insignia of a labyrinth on it. There was no crew visible, but the deck stacked high with crates. It passed slowly and quite close to the cliffs, but I never saw any movement on it. Down the coast, one of the regular bandit ships that often passed our home swerved sharply to avoid passing close to a ship with the sign of a labyrinth. Of course, I asked my father about this ship, and he frowned and kneeled in front of me. The organization that carries the sign of a labyrinth is an ancient and secret one. You must never be seen by them. If you spot a ship with the flag of a labyrinth, I want you to run back home and stay inside until it passes. Do you understand? I didn't. But I also understood that I shouldn't ask any more questions, and so I kept quiet. when I saw more and more of these strange ships. Crew were rarely ever on the deck, and if they were, they wore hoods and worked with their heads bowed. Always the crates piled high on their decks, lashed down with thick rope, and always a flag with the sign of the labyrinth. But I also refused to run away. I would stay hidden and watch them pass until they were lost into the horizon or to a turn in the shore. When I reached the age of 8, my father started to depart on regular business trips. It would have been good to do this sooner, he said, but I didn't want to leave you alone when you were so young. Now that you are a little older, I will occasionally need to go tend to affairs. I will return soon. Do not worry. He hired a series of caretakers for me during his trips, none of whom lasted long. My father assured me that this wasn't due to any sort of difficulty with caring for me, only that the young workforce in our rural region tended to migrate to the great capitals of Europe seeking better jobs, and so one was always looking for good help. It was only much later it would occur to me that my father did not want any one person to know what schedule of his trips were. So having the caretakers regularly replaced. But I never used my father's absences as an excuse to cause real trouble. I took responsibility he put he put on me seriously. I wanted to prove more to myself than to him that I deserve his trust, and so I would sometimes sneak out of bed after being put there far too early by some exhausted caretaker or the other. I would only use those hours snatched from sleep as an opportunity to read or wander the estate at night time, when all the familiar landmarks turned to indistinct shadows. Or often I would sit precariously in my window sill, feet dangling over the lengthy drops, smelling the nearby sea. I had never in my life been far enough from the sea that I couldn't smell it, at least as a faint undercurrent under the other smells that filled my life. On one of my father's trips, I snuck out in the morning to meet Albert. We played hide and seek and then ate a simple lunch of fruit and cheese on a rock by the cove, our toes dangling into the water. "There are rumors about your father," he said. "No, there aren't." I glared at him. "What kind?" "I don't know." He shrugged and stuffed a large piece of cheese into his mouth. "Tell me." "People say your father is some kind of a spy for a king, or even an agent of the devil, and his journeys are crime journeys." Albert nodded solemnly. "For crimes." "That's stupid. Don't say things like that to me. Ever again." I ate the rest of the cheese, all in a few bites, just to punish him. Although later this would be more of a punishment on me. Despite my dismal, what Albert said stayed with me. What did my father do? How did we afford the estate? And why was he never specific about where he was going on these business trips of his? I started to pay more attention to his comings and goings. I noticed there was a great variability in how he packed on some trips. He brought a full trunk, which he would struggle to load into the carriage before leaving, but on other trips he packed lightly and haphazardly, throwing only a few necessities into his sack and then taking off on a horse. The care with which he packed did not correlate at all with the length of his business trips. The mystery was deepened by an even stranger discovery. One night, against the repeated and increasingly desperate commands of my current caretaker, I was sitting awake in my window sill. Despite my disobedience, my body did very much want to comply with the command to sleep, and so I was gently nodding off, leaning against the sturdy stone frame, when I heard a voice out in the garden. Hidden as we were, we never had to contend with thieves. But ours was a large estate, and so theft was always a possibility. Perhaps our time had finally come, and my father was not here to help. As I sprang up, quite awake now, I realized, to my absolute confusion, that I recognized the voice. It was the voice of my father. He was in the garden 2 days into a week-long business trip. My first impulse was to run out and joyously greet him, assuming that he had returned earlier than expected, but something about the situation made me cautious. Instead, I slipped out of my room, past my caretaker, who had fallen asleep while reading at the table in the kitchen, and out the front door. I moved as quietly as I could through the fields and gardens, ducking behind the hedges and trees, and there was my father, walking with a group of men down to the water. A rowboat waited on the shore, and in the deep water of the cove, one of the small ships that bore no flag I recognized as belonging to bandits. My father was chatting with the men from the ship, and he even affectionately slapped the back of one. I had no idea what to make of this, but my horror, I started to realize that perhaps Albert had been right. Perhaps my father was going on crime trips to do crime. As I came to this realization, I saw movement in the hill above the group of men. A figure was walking along the crest. No one but me noticed the figure. I recognized him. It was the shambling man who I had seen disappear into the water a few years before. He walked along the hill with that strange, stiff lurch, too far away to be anything but a silhouette in the faint moonlight. But his movements were unmistakable. Then he crossed the threshold of the hill and was gone. I hurried back to my bed where I lay, frightened and unsleeping, until my caretaker called me to breakfast. When my father returned from the trip, I greeted him as normal and said nothing for a few days. Then one day during lunch, I casually told him I had dreamed a vivid and unusual dream while he was away. He grunted interest, but did not immediately pay attention. I told him I had dreamed his voice in the garden while he was gone, and that I crept out and followed the sound, and I had seen him talking with a group of bandits down by the cove. My father set his food aside and glared at me. He bit his lip, debating with himself for a moment, then sighed. "Doesn't seem like you are telling me a dream," he said. "Papa, why were you here when you were supposed to be away on a business trip? Why did you lie to me?" Not everyone gets to know everything about everybody. "Tell me," I shouted, a young girl despising her inability to control the tone and volume of her voice, her face trembling in the effort of holding in tears. My father nodded slowly, and then he leaned in and addressed me seriously. "All right, my little one. I suppose you would need to learn this eventually. I was hoping to wait a while longer, but life so rarely gives us what we want. I will tell you what it is I do on these trips and let you into my secret life. But this is a deadly serious thing, and you must be responsible enough to tell no one, as one careless word from you is likely to get one or both of us killed. Can you promise this?" I nodded, terrified, but also determined to live up to that responsibility. My lips trembled and tears poured from my eyes, which I had been ashamed of, but I was young and the heaviness of this moment was overwhelming. My father took my hands into his large, warm hands. His face softened. "Very well," he said. "This is my secret." And that's the end of chapter 3.